This is Heron Lakes Golf Club in North Portland. It is bordered to the east by the Portland International Raceway and to the north by the Portland Expo Center. It's a pretty normal golf course. For only $33 on the weekdays, you can have what they advertise as an unforgettable golfing experience. With distinctive layouts and breathtaking views, it is a must-play for anyone who loves the game of golf. Well, what they don't tell you up front is that this is, by far, the most important golf course in the Pacific Northwest. This is the former site of Vanport, Oregon. Nestled between North Portland and the Columbia River, Vanport will be a project built out of sheer necessity. It used to be one of the largest public housing projects in American history. It used to be the second largest city in Oregon, the fifth largest in the Northwest, a crucial part of American shipbuilding industry in World War II. And on Memorial Day of 1948, Vanport will be wiped clean off the face of the earth. It would never be rebuilt. This is its story. The story ostensibly starts on a day which will live in infamy. By forcing America into a war, Pearl Harbor gave the American economy and the American people, who were sluggishly recovering from the Great Depression, a sudden united purpose: to beat the ever-loving crud out of the Japanese. And to do that, to win a war over the entire Pacific, you need boats. Congress understood the task. In late 1940, even before American entry into the war, they authorized the Emergency Shipbuilding Program, which aimed to modernize America's old supply fleet, which was still primarily leftover from World War I. 17 shipyards on the West Coast would end up building ships for the program, and 3 of them were here in Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington. The man in charge of building and operating these 3 would be the industrialist Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser is a really influential person in his own right, and if you know where to look, his fingerprints can be found all over the West Coast. A child of German immigrants in New York, Kaiser migrated out west as a young man and founded a construction company, which ended up being a significant contributor to building the Grand Coulee Dam and the Bonneville Dams on the Columbia River and the Hoover Dam on the Colorado. During the war, he started as the chair of an organization that donated clothes to refugees from Europe, and then obviously got into shipbuilding. After the war, he started an aluminum company that's still around, and a car company, Kaiser Motors, which would eventually turn into AM General. And the cherry on top was his foray into healthcare, which ended up being Kaiser Permanente. Anyways, the emergency shipbuilding program's original goal was only to aid the British against the Nazis. So Kaiser initially had only one shipyard in Portland, the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation, or Oregon Ship, which opened in September of 1941. But after Pearl Harbor and direct American entry into the war, the program was massively scaled up, resulting in the Vancouver shipyard and the Swan Island shipyard being built in 1942. These 3 shipyards would be responsible for 706 ships ordered by the emergency shipbuilding program during the war, as well as 50 escort carriers for the Navy. And with shipyards in the area being 3 times larger than originally intended, one problem quickly became apparent. All of these ships needed people to build them. Portland had a pre-war population of around 305,000. The Kaiser shipyards would end up employing 97,000 people, promising high wages and a patriotic job that would benefit the American war effort, bringing tens of thousands of new workers into the city. Around 160,000 people would migrate to Portland to work in some sort of wartime activity in the city, a 50% increase within only a few years. This exacerbated a housing shortage and economic struggles that had plagued Portland since the beginning of the Great Depression. Portland, historically, was a very conservative city, which hampered its economic recovery from the Depression. Socially, Portland was one of the least diverse and least tolerant cities in America, which I'll cover later. Economically, city leaders were reluctant to use federal funding from FDR's New Deal. Specifically for housing, the obvious solution of building cheap public housing was very unpopular among Portlanders, who believed that it would harm private interests in Portland's image. The Federal Housing Act of 1937 aimed to reduce urban slumming nationwide. It did 2 main things. Firstly, it created what would become the Federal Public Housing Authority, which provided federal money for public housing projects. Secondly, it funded the creation of local housing authorities to build and manage public housing. Other West Coast cities like Seattle and San Francisco used this funding to create their own authorities. Portland City Council and local businessmen shut the idea down, with Mayor Joseph Carson calling it, quote, unadulterated communism. So, recovery was sluggish. Shanty towns and slums remained as part of life well into the latter half of the 1930s. Historian Carl Abbott described Portland at the time as, quote, a city that had ceased to grow. However, once it became painfully obvious that the growing crisis wouldn't correct itself, city leaders were forced to create the Housing Authority of Portland, only in late 1941, a few days after Pearl Harbor. However, the Housing Authority still dragged their feet and aimed for the bare minimum of temporary measures, with the goal of keeping business as usual in Portland, and attempting to solve increasing homelessness in ways that would impose the least impact on the community. This approach wasn't enough. By September of 1942, workers were living in tents and trailers. They spent most of their free time on the street. The city's failure to house shipyard workers quickly became a threat to the operation of the shipyards themselves. So, Kaiser's solution was to avoid the city's government altogether, going directly to the Federal Public Housing Authority and the Maritime Commission, which approved and funded the purchase of 650 acres of marsh and pasture north of the city alongside the Columbia River, in the middle of the three shipyards. They were going to build 9,000 new housing units, housing a maximum of 42,000 people, the largest wartime public housing project in America. It would at first be named Kaiserville, but it took on a much more well-known name, a portmanteau of the two cities it was located between. This is Vanport. The wartime industry's impact on Portland wasn't only alarming for Portland's leaders, but also for many Portland residents, who made it clear that newcomers weren't welcome in their city. In a letter to an intern Japanese-American friend, a resident described the city as being filled with, quote, swarms of roughly dressed, roughly acting people. However, local anger was concentrated towards one particular group. Racial discrimination was banned in military industry according to federal policy, and the shipyards were desperate to hire pretty much anyone who could come to Portland and work for a few years. Thousands of African Americans decided to take up their offer and move to Portland, and were met with hostility on a level that was comparable to the Deep South. Because Oregon has a fundamental problem with racism. 100 years before World War II in Vanport, while the issue of slavery slowly tore the nation apart, colonial Oregon was cooking up some of the most racist laws in the country. In the early 1840s, with increasing migration over the Oregon Trail, settlers in a disputed Oregon country formed the Provisional Government, a loose collection of prominent settlers, both Canadian and American, that governed the Pacific Northwest until the British and American governments formally divided the region in 1848. Many white settlers believed that it would be impossible to coexist with blacks in Oregon. They would disturb the peace, bring the wider slavery debate into Oregon, and incite Native American rebellions against white rule. These beliefs were common among northern whites before the Civil War, but a commonly cited cause among modern historians for their popularity in Oregon is the Comstock Affair in March 1844, in which a minor property dispute between a Native American named Comstock and two black settlers escalated into a lethal brawl in Oregon City. Shortly after, in June 1844, the provisional government's response was to pass laws excluding black people, both free and enslaved, from even entering the state. The main author of the exclusion laws in Oregon, prominent lawyer and future governor of California, Peter Burnett, said, quote, "The object is to keep clear of that most troublesome class of population." As professor and historian Quinter Taylor explains, many American settlers in Oregon had left from former frontier states in the Old Northwest or the Upper South, which all also had discriminatory laws against free blacks. These people tended to dislike the economic and political domination of slaveholders that came with the institution of slavery, but still held racist beliefs. Early Oregonians were much more opposed to the entrenched class of slaveholders than slavery itself, and brought that attitude to the Northwest. When Oregon officially became a U.S. state in the late 1850s, these laws would be reworked and expanded in its first state constitution, which banned blacks from entering the state, and now also banned non-whites from voting. Oregon was fully intended to be a white-only ethnostate. These laws were eventually overridden by the 14th and 15th Amendments in the aftermath of the Civil War and removed from the state constitution in 1926. Of course, Oregon didn't ratify these amendments until the late 20th century, not until 1973 in the case of the 14th. But the message they sent, that minorities were not welcome in Oregon, never really went away. According to the 1920 census, black people made up around 10% of the American population, around 10.5 million people. However, out of a population of almost 800,000, there are only 2,144 black people in all of Oregon, a minuscule 0.27% of the population. At the same time, the KKK in Oregon had 35,000 members, or 4.5% of Oregon's population, the highest membership per capita in the country. For a period in the 1920s, the second KKK grew influential enough to run a whole political machine in the state, getting heavily involved in Portland's municipal government and helping to elect a governor in 1922. Their influence would fall in the late 20s as part of a broader nationwide trend, but the backwards attitude of Oregonians continued. By the 1940 census, Oregon only had 2,565 black people, of which around 2,000 lived in Portland. Members of Portland's small black community had to live with regular discrimination. Most businesses refused to hire black people at all. Men were mostly limited to railroad work, and women mostly to domestic work. Journalist Catherine Hall Bogle, in an interview with the Oregon Historical Society, described the impossible task of even getting a job. Quote, "There were no black salespeople in town, not a one. There were no black elevator operators. There were no blacks visible in any business situation except those very few places where a black person had established his own private business." The first big wave or two of people included, for example, black stevedores who had worked as stevedores all their lives in the South. But here in Portland, they could not be employed as longshoremen because the Longshoremen's Union in Oregon wouldn't let them join. That left them pretty amazed. It was the same with the Truck Drivers Union. They did not allow black people to join the union. That again amazed the black men who had driven trucks and all kinds of vehicles in the South, but were not allowed to do that here just because they were black. The Electrical Union operated the same way. They refused to hire black people. The Laundry Workers Union was the same way. These were all astonishing situations and very upsetting to the black people who had just come to Portland. Beginning in the 1920s, the Portland Realty Board gradually pressured black people to live in the Albina neighborhood in northeast Portland along Williams Avenue. It's worth it to mention that Albina was a fairly desirable neighborhood for now, but it started to have a reputation in Portland for being the black part of town, with consequences later. Realtors often refused to sell homes outside of Albina to black people, and when they did, white neighbors often harassed them. Dr. DeNorval Unthink, a black physician that would later become a leader of Portland's black community, initially moved into an all-white neighborhood in 1929. He and his family were harassed and threatened by his neighbors, forcing him to move 4 times before settling down near Albina. All of this was possible because of how small the black community in Portland was, a legacy of Oregon's black exclusion laws which made racial confrontation seemingly invisible. The war would change this forever, and racial tensions quickly began to boil in its early years. Portland's leadership continued its discriminatory policies and applied them to newcomers. In 1942, during the height of the housing crisis, Mayor Earl Riley argued that large numbers of migrating blacks were a threat to Portland society. A spokesperson for the Central East Portland Community Club argued that they should be housed on the city outskirts. A proposed integrated housing project along Flint Street in northeast Portland was met with hostility from white community groups and was forced to be canceled. The Housing Authority moved incoming black workers exclusively to projects in Albina, Vanport, and Gilds Lake, a smaller project on Portland's northwest outskirts. They believed that they had no responsibility to integrate newcomers into the fabric of city life. Historian E. Kimbark MacColl stated that the Housing Authority was, quote, an agent of private enterprise whose sole function was to manage wartime housing projects and dispose of them as soon as practicable. Portland's existing black community opened their homes for workers. Local civil rights groups such as the Portland Council of Churches and the Urban League of Portland were formed and began to advocate for the expansion of public housing and desegregation in wartime and post-war Portland. By the time the war ended, Portland's racial makeup had been changed permanently. At the end of 1945, around 15,000 black people lived in Portland, almost all of whom had come to work in the shipyards.
We're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. After federal approval, construction for the Vanport project began in late August of 1942. The site on the east side would be bounded by Denver Avenue, the west by a railway berm, and to the south by the Columbia Slough. Adding to the difficulty was that the whole area was very marshy, and the site was no exception. The site also required levees on all four sides to protect the city against flooding. The railway berm on the west side was good enough to be repurposed for flood control, but that still left 3 sides to be built. Winter rainfall also made the site extremely muddy, complicating construction further. Another difficulty was the balance of power between the 3 groups in charge, especially with the housing authorities still seething over what they saw as Kaiser and the feds interfering in Portland affairs. City Commissioner William Bowe said that the shipyard boom had, quote, put the cart before the horse, blaming Kaiser for causing homelessness in the first place. However, they eventually hammered out a unique agreement for Vanport. Kaiser would be mainly responsible for design and construction. The federal government would fund it, but after Vanport was finished, the housing authority was given the right to administer it day to day. This was a balance that worked all the way until the end of the war. Housing was made of standardized prefab wooden apartment buildings, 703 in total. There were also 11 schools, 5 recreational centers, a movie theater, and a library. People had started moving in during the construction process, and by August of 1943, less than 1 year later, the city was more or less fully complete. By the end of 1943, Vanport was home to around 39,000 people. However, once the novelty of actually having a home wore off, Vanport's flaws quickly became apparent. It was built as quickly as possible, and it showed. The upside to living in Vanport was that it was better than being homeless. The downsides, well, noise was a major issue. Those who moved in early had to deal with construction noise, and since the shipyards worked 24/7, there was never any quiet time in the city at all. The apartments themselves were very small, there were food shortages, and what food there was too expensive. There were no telephones unless you had authorization from the federal government. The heating in the buildings was really bad, and that led to a lot of other more creative ways to keep warm, such as using your stovetop. This would start a lot of small fires, which in a densely packed wooden development was incredibly dangerous. And even though Vanport was one of the only mixed-race housing projects in Portland, and even though racial discrimination was against federal housing guidelines, the housing authority still enforced de facto segregation, similar to the rest of Portland. Whites and blacks were housed in separate sectors of the town, and designated black units consistently had very long wait lists, a result of the short supply of housing for non-whites. Nonetheless, it was by far the most racially integrated part of Portland outside of Albina. But despite all of its challenges and shortcomings, wartime life adapted and continued. For example, Vanport's school system was notable for both being racially integrated and for running around the clock given the 24/7 nature of shipyard work. For adults, life was very dominated by this work with not much else. There was little community spirit and no recreational organizations would be formed until after the war. Vanport was understood by everyone to be a temporary wartime project. It was described as a big hotel and functioned like one. Very few people were there to stick around. People wanted to have a job, get some money, and bolster the war effort along the way. Once work dried up, there wasn't much to do but leave. And by 1945, the writing was on the wall. The war was ending. Early that year, well before the war's actual end, the shipyards started laying people off. People started to move out. By July, Vanport only had 26,000 residents. Federal funding for Vanport began to be scaled down, and a debate was underway on the future of the city. The Housing Authority was adamant on the post-war demolition of Vanport and Guilds Lake and a reversal of wartime change in Portland. In a letter to the FPHA, Housing Authority Chairman Chester Moores described the city's plan to industrialize the site and to remove a, quote, troublesome blighted area, a reference to Vanport's black sectors. Now, did the housing authority and Portland city leadership figure out how to relocate Vanport's people? Did they plan ahead for the impact of 26,000 newly homeless people on Portland's housing situation and economy? One that would inevitably worsen because of returning veterans? Did they actually give a shit about the people of Vanport? Hell no. As far as the city was concerned, Vanporters, and especially its black community, were expected to fend for themselves or leave the city altogether. Bill Barry, a distinguished activist from Oberlin, Ohio, was invited to become the first director of the Urban League of Portland in 1945. When he first arrived in Portland, the city's business leaders offered to collaborate with him in the league, to arrange the departure of African American workers out of Portland. So, since Vanport's demolition was a certainty, the housing authority had to find a new post-war use of the land. They initially wanted it to become a rehab center for returning soldiers. This plan was quickly rejected by the Army, the Navy, and the VA, so the housing authority instead pivoted to a purely industrial vision. However, the city didn't really have an actual vision for the industrial plan either, and there was concerns about the site's marshiness and vulnerability to flooding, so they recommended a 6-month delay, and... oh, shucks. After the war, to no one's surprise, Portland's housing crisis continued. Portland's veterans returned home from abroad, and they needed places to live as well. The housing authority still aimed for Vanport's demolition in the long term, and indeed about a third of its units had been demolished around the end of the war, but it was given an overall stay of execution, for now. We're winging it from here. Neither Henry Kaiser nor the federal government or the housing authority planned for this. Vanport, which was originally built as the most makeshift wartime solution, now had to be reborn in a new post-war Portland. Vanport soldiers on. In its new life, Vanport began to forge a new identity as a low-income community for veterans. Under the 1944 GI Bill, veterans returning from war were granted two things: financial support for a house and a free college education. The new Vanport could offer both. Even though a significant portion of its buildings were demolished, Vanport still had the capacity to house some 25,000 people. And if someone could start up a college, then Vanport would become, if not attractive, at least a possible destination for returning vets and their families. And that's exactly what one Stephen E. Epler did. A lifelong teacher, he is notable for inventing the sport of six-man football at a Nebraska high school before joining the Navy during the war. He settled in Vanport in January of 1946 and founded Vanport College later that same year, which is the first public university not only in Vanport but in all of Portland. Vanport College would enroll around 1,400 students in its first year in the fall of 1946, 90% of which were veterans. The college would quickly become a feature of a new Vanport. The Oregonian reported that Vanport had begun to look like a small college town. And finally, the most important aspect of post-war Vanport was that it soon became an actual experiment for a racially tolerant Portland. During the waning stages of the war, blacks made up around 18% of Vanport's population. Certainly not notable by a national standard, but more than enough for Vanport to be derisively labeled as a black project by some Portlanders. But as the shipyards closed, black residents were more likely to remain reliant on public housing than whites, a result of continuing discrimination in housing practices. By 1946, that percentage had shot up to 35%. Advocating for African Americans in Vanport, Albina, and Guilds Lake were a growing contingent of civil rights activists and urbanists. The Urban League of Portland and the NAACP lobbied for expanding public housing and eliminating discrimination and segregation by the housing authority and private realtors, and generally advanced the cause of integration among political elites and Portland's people. In January of 1948, the Urban League, city planners, and Vanport citizens finally convinced the housing authority to desegregate Vanport and Guilds Lake, a huge victory for civil rights interests in Portland. However, this victory was brief for Vanporters, because unbeknownst to its 18,500 residents, a destructive force of nature is slowly building 1,000 miles up the Columbia River. 5 months after Vanport was officially desegregated, it would be wiped completely off of the map. In winter, usually from around November to April, the Pacific Northwest is impacted by storms that blow in from the ocean, giving it its infamous winter gloominess. Most of that rain and snow eventually drains into the Columbia River, which flows from the Canadian Rockies in British Columbia to the Pacific on the Oregon-Washington border. That winter of 1947 to 1948 had above normal precipitation, By April 1st, meteorologists in Canada and the US were warning of the possibility of floods in the Columbia River Basin. For now, it is merely a hypothetical. The year prior, 1946 to 1947, had similar amounts of precipitation, but due to what happened in the rest of the spring, severe floods were avoided. If the snow is given a chance to melt slowly and gradually, there should be no hazard. It remains cold in April. This is concerning for one major reason. If it warms up too quickly, the snow melts all at once, leading to certain flooding. Previous winters had started to warm by this time, but in 1948, as it stands, we're running out of time before summer arrives in June. Here is the temperature 8,000 feet above Spokane, Washington from May 1948 to mid-June. The dashed line is a trend of what temperature you would expect given data dating back to 1939, and the dots represent daily temperatures recorded in 1948. Most of May remains unusually cold. It remains this way up until around the 22nd or 23rd, when summer weather arrives practically overnight. The snow was not given a chance to melt slowly. It is melting in a week. And there is one more thing. It has been raining this whole time, over 4 inches in parts of eastern Washington in 2 weeks. All of this means that by late May, every meteorologist in the Pacific Northwest is shitting their pants. And Vanport is in the crosshairs. So, how are the fine folks at the Housing Authority of Portland responding to this imminent crisis? By the 25th of May, the rising waters of the Columbia reached northern and southern levees, prompting action from the authority. To their credit, the Housing Authority did take the threat seriously, gathering 47,000 sacks of sand, 150 trucks on standby, and several emergency volunteers in the week or so heading into Memorial Day weekend. However, since flood control was somewhat outside the typical responsibilities of the Housing Authority, they consulted the premier authority on flood control in all of America, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The engineers, after what was certainly a long and thorough investigation, informed the Housing Authority that they had nothing to worry about, continue business as usual. Friday, May 28th. A meeting is held at Red Cross headquarters. Attending were Red Cross officials, Housing Authority officials, and a few local officials. Not in attendance were the engineers, who remained confident in their previous assessment. The meeting topic was evacuation of Vanport. The parties in attendance ultimately deemed it impossible at the time. The Housing Authority could rehouse maybe 1,500 people, and the Red Cross 7,500, well short of Vanport's population of over 18,000. The prospect of evacuation was kicked down the road a little, with another meeting scheduled for Monday. On Saturday the 29th, residents woke up to a message slipped under their doors reassuring them of the safety of the city. Remember, dikes are safe at present. You will be warned if necessary. You will have time to leave. Don't get excited. Memorial Day, Sunday, May 30th, 1948. It was a sunny day, nice weather, with a high of 76. The pleasant weather meant that many people had decided to go out for the holiday. On the Columbia River, 15 feet would be considered a flood. In 2023, the highest river level measured in Vancouver was around 13.5 feet in mid-May. 2022 peaked at nearly 17 feet. On May 30th of 1948, Vancouver measured 28.3 feet. Out of all places, the railway berm was the one least expected to go. It was never specifically designed to be a levee, but it was massive. 120 feet wide at the base, 75 feet wide at the top. Due to the geography around Vanport, the water had reached it last out of all the levees, and it was not in danger of overflowing. At 4:17 p.m., the berm gave way. There were a number of smaller sloughs within the city's west side, which bought citizens an invaluable 40 minutes as they filled. That, along with the fact that many people weren't home in the first place, probably prevented many casualties. But by 5 o'clock, the city itself quickly started to flood. Again, Vanporters caught another fortunate break. The wooden apartment buildings, which had previously been a huge fire hazard, detached from their foundations and floated, and turned into life-saving rafts. An organized search effort quickly began looking for marooned residents in their homes. By 9 o'clock, it was believed that everyone was out. 9:30. An emergency vehicle with a lone driver is traveling along the Denver Avenue levee when it also suddenly gives way. They are the first confirmed death. The Denver Avenue break widens around 500 feet, flooding the area east of Vanport, carrying apartments with it. Within 6 hours, the entirety of Vanport City was destroyed. The official report stated 15 deaths, although that number was heavily disputed by survivors and could be much higher. Portland's people welcomed 18,000 newly homeless Vanporters, of which a third were black, into the city. For weeks, refugees slept in churches, schools, or in some cases were invited into people's homes. This was a triumphant success that the city's newspapers were eager to publish, this heartwarming story of a city desegregating in a time of crisis. But the reality for many Vanporters was much different. The housing authority was willing to temporarily reopen closed projects, the conditions of which made them unpopular among Vanporters. The worst and the most crowded of these temporary measures were at the abandoned barracks in the now closed Swan Island shipyard. 9 of 10 people who were moved to Swan Island were black. As for long-term solutions, business interests used the flood as a pretext to finally kill mass public housing in Portland. In 1950, Guilds Lake and the temporary Swan Island project closed for good, even though they were still occupied. For black people that were kicked out of these projects, the only option left was albina. Throughout the 1950s, the city's realtors enforced an unofficial red line policy, a return to before the war. And as for Vanport itself, the city would be scrapped over the summer of 1948. By April of the following year, it was finished. Vanport was no more. In several ways, Vanport still lives, if you know where to look. For example, Vanport College, described by students as the college that wouldn't die, successfully re-established itself downtown as Portland State University in 1955. The city's memory is also being preserved by Portland citizens with annual events such as the Vanport Mosaic Festival and the Vanport Jazz Festival commemorating and celebrating the city. It is through these people that the story of Vanport lives on. This is crucial because under its hyper-liberal veneer, Portland still struggles with awareness of its own unpalatable history. On one hand, Vanport is a story of ingenuity and resilience, but it is also a story of a city that was arguably the heart of white supremacy in America, and how it was dragged kicking and screaming into the modern age. And this story directly shapes many of Portland's problems today. You can't run from it forever.